Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us.
Carousel, Jardin du Luxembourg. A roof, a shadow, round and round it spins for a little while, this brightly coloured band of horses from a hesitating land that's gone. Some do have more than reins, a cart or carriage, but they manage to present brave faces, as they must, while at their side a furious crimson lion keeps its pride, and now and then an old white elephant. You'll even find a monarch of the glen down from the hills, except he has a saddle with a little girl in blue who's fastened in. And there a pale boy sits, while underneath his small hand's grip is growing hot and faint as the lion's tongue pokes out between its teeth, and now and then an old white elephant. And the girls who pass by sitting upright may have outgrown all those pony games already, but cheerfully hang on, a touch unsteady, and stare off up elsewhere, perhaps this way. And now and then an old white elephant. And round it goes, accelerates, and stops, forever orbiting with no clear aim. A red, a green, a grey one, blurry shapes in profile, barely formed, go through the same. And sometimes there's a brief, bright smile that drops a blessing as it passes, before it sweeps the stake back to this breathless blindfold game.
Thank you. So that was The Carousel by Rainer Maria Rilke, read by John Greening. John is the translator of a new edition of Rilke's new poems, just released from Baylor University Press. He's also one of our favorite authors. He is a well-established poet. He has released his own poetry with us now on 2 different volumes. You can find those at our website. But John has just released his brand new translation of Rilke's new poems. And so why release this translation now? I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about the project, John.
Translating the Rilke surprised me. It suddenly happened. But then it occurred to me, it's 150 years this week, in fact, on the 4th, since his birth. And indeed, next year, 2026, is the centenary of his death. So that was a spur in itself. But he's always been at the back of my mind, and I sort of put off. I mean, way back when I was a student, I tried 1 or 2 very unsatisfactory translations. And I did the one about Orpheus and Eurydice, quite a famous one that Stephen Spender translated in one of my collections in the 90s. So he's always been there. But the new poems, there's almost 200 of them. And I realized there are only about 5, I counted, 5 full editions of the complete new poems translated into English, which is astonishing compared with the Duino elegies and the sonnets to Orpheus. There are dozens and dozens. So there's something about them that has made poets resist taking them on. And in fact, there are a lot of biblical poems in there. Maybe that's the reason. That's one of the reasons I thought Baylor would be interested in it, because Rilke took a lot of stories from the New Testament, Old Testament, and they're perhaps quite difficult to translate. Anyway, I had a go at it, and by happenstance, it seems to be a good time to bring it out.
Well, we're really thankful that you did have a go at it. So if you could talk to us a little bit about who Rilke was for those of our listeners who may be unfamiliar, and why is he of enduring interest so long after his death?
Well, he's the major Austro-German poet of the 20th century. Probably, I mean, other people might bring up Brecht or whatever, but I think it has to be Rilke, simply because he has such an international status. Actually, particularly in America, for years he's been hugely popular. And as to why that is, it's difficult to pin down. It's a deeply spiritual poet. One critic, I think, suggested that people find whatever they're looking for in Rilke. So he appeals to all kinds of people. And he could be translated in all kinds of ways. So he has that international readership, and he's really clicked into something which is right for our age, and has been for many ages. I mean, these were written 1907, 1908, or published 1907, 1908. So all that time, he's been so popular. So I think he parallels perhaps the work of someone like Yeats over here, particularly his extraordinary development, a poet like Yeats, who started off with a kind of Celtic twilight and then the very sort of direct, potent late poems. Something similar happened with Rilke. He had the early, again, deeply spiritual, but rather sort of flowery early poems, influenced by Russian culture, a lot of them, Book of Hours and so on. And then he had these new poems, which I've translated, where he worked with Rodin. He was the sculptor Auguste Rodin. He was his secretary. And working with Rodin so closely, he watched Rodin, the way Rodin looked at things, studied them, got to the very essence of a thing just by staring hard at it. And Rilke taught himself to do something very similar, which has, I think that's become quite an important thing for subsequent poets, another reason for his popularity. Then later he went on to even more different areas of abstraction with the elegies. But I'm very interested in that attention to the thing. They're sometimes called thing poems, these new poems, neue Gedichte. But they're not actually all poems about things. There are poems about, I don't know, about lace making. There's one about a panther. There's one about, a particular person, a particular place. But that's a really sort of shorthand, the thing poems.
Yes. Okay, great. And I think we'll come back to that question of attention that he is so famous for. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the process of translating these poems? Because any work of translation is a complex endeavor, but translating poetry in particular has its own set of challenges and difficulties, and also, rewarding possibilities. So what were your goals in translating this? And are there things about Rilke that do make him particularly challenging or particularly rewarding to translate?
Yes. I suppose my goal was to finish, because nearly 200 of them are just halfway through. You despair whether you'll ever get through. And there are some of those poems which are quite resistant. You realize, some of them I don't think have been translated into English at all, astonishingly. It tends to be the same ones, like the Panther and the Carousel, which come up again and again. So what my goal is, yes, to make them readable English poems in English. And this is not a parallel text edition, many are. So you've just got my poems. So I wanted them to be faithful. I wanted them to be faithful to the originals, but I wanted them to be enjoyable as poems. I mean, I wouldn't have enjoyed writing them if they hadn't been decent poems in themselves. But I decided I was going to do what hasn't often been done, and I realized why as I was doing it, and that's to follow his rhyme and meter. He was, people forget, he was an extremely careful and clever and virtuosic user of rhyme and meter, and he's very often just turned into free verse, and then you lose half of the effort. I mean, you got some sense of it with that Carousel one. I think the patterns going on in that poem, but that poem, incidentally, has a particular problem. That darn elephant, the white elephant in the room, as you might say, because in German, und dann und wann ein weißer Elefant sounds great. Getting that into, it's got to have that meter, ti-dum, but to do it in English, you've got to put in extra words. German's so polysyllabic. So I came up with that particular line. Different poets have done it different ways. So I wanted to follow the rhyme and meter, and I found as I did it, Seamus Heaney says if you're translating poetry, it has to validate something in you as a poet. And I found that was happening. So they felt like real poems to me, and it felt it was going deep into something within me. But following the rhyme and meter, well, a lot of German poetry has a meter rather like a Hiawatha, tum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti. Most English and American poetry is ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tum. So I tried to follow that, and you'll hear one in a moment when I read it, and it's quite a challenge to do because they tend to instinctively turn back into ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tum. So things like that I was trying to make it different, because it's not much been done before. I mean, I'm chiefly I'm more a poet than a German expert. My German's not bad, but that's the main quality I'm bringing to this. And most of those who have translated Rilke, I think, have been German experts, not necessarily poets. I think it's probably more important that you are a poet if you're going to translate poetry, to be honest. Anyway, this is my attempt at Rilke, and it feels important to me, and I hope other people will feel that too.
Absolutely. Well, I hope you will give us another opportunity to feel it here with you. So I think we've got a couple more poems for you to read here for us.
Yes, in fact, this is an example of the trochaic poem. This is an example of him looking at something. He loved writing about churches, and particularly a lot of these poems are written in Paris. And Notre Dame, he'd go to Notre Dame and he'd stare at the statues and the rose window and so on. This is one of the statues which I think is by the rose window, or was before the fire. I imagine it's still there. Called Adam. There's an Adam and Eve. And so this is a sonnet. There's lots of sonnets in the collection. So listen to that sort of emphasis on the first word, Adam. Dazed, he stands where the cathedral starts, climbing steeply to the stained glass rose. Shocked, it seems, by that apotheosis which so fed and fertilized his roots, raising him in pride above the others. And he puffs out, pleased to have endured, focused on his task. He was the ploughman who was clueless as to where the exits were out of the finished Eden to a new earth. In all honesty, God was not so easy to persuade, and preferred to threaten him with death when he broached it, rather than agree. But he'd not give in, and she'd give birth. So, the little play at the end there, that give in, give birth, those are the things that Rilke does a lot of that, a lot of that sort of jokiness, playing with words. And you've got to try and reproduce those things somewhere. So I've indulged myself a few times. I've even used a few modern expressions, modern metaphors, not in an extreme way, not like Robert Lowell, who modernized everything, went crazy with his imitations. But I have allowed myself a few liberties now and again with these poems. So here's another of the sonnets, slightly different, but this is called Blue Hydrangea. Rilke did grow hydrangeas, apparently. I don't know how popular they are in America. Over here in Britain, they're a bit drab, I always think, over here, but that's Britain for you. But Rilke, I suspect Rilke's were a bit more spectacular. He was going to call this group of poems Blue Hydrangea at one point, but he came up with just new poems in the end. So, Blue Hydrangea. How like the last green in a set of paints, these leaves, so dried out, rough and dreary behind their petal stalks, which seem to carry a blue not theirs, but mirrored from a distance. They mirror it through tearful, blurry clouds, as if they need to keep on losing it. And there, in yellow, grey and violet, how like those old blue letter-writing pads, and washed out like a toddler's overalls no longer wearable, that can't be spoilt. How short this little life of ours now feels. And look, the blue appears to be returning, perhaps a single stalk, but there, behold, a thrill of blue, delighted by the greening. Well, there's me putting my own name into the poem, which is again, a cheeky thing to do. But this was written around the time that Richard Strauss was writing all his work, and he used to do that all the time. He put his own name in little personal jokes in self-quotation, so I felt I could do that as well. So it gives you a sense of the variety in these poems, and they are various, extraordinarily various, even though there's almost 200 of them. I don't think you'll ever be bored.
That's fantastic. And one thing that strikes me as you're reading and as you're talking about this process is how deeply personal poetry writing is, and then also how deeply personal poetry reading is. So it just struck me as you were talking that if you could reflect for a little bit on the deeply personal ways in which you as a poet have received Rilke and then are presenting him to us, and how you strike the balance of trying to give us a very kind of a real sense of who this poet is, while also, as you say, including, little jokes, little things about your name or things like that are very personal to you. How do you strike that balance as a poet and as a translator of poetry in particular?
It's a bit of a mystery, really, Josh. And in a sense, it has to remain that. If you know too much about what you're doing with poetry, sometimes it can sort of stymie you, it can paralyze you. So, and because I'd been reading Rilke for years, I knew a certain amount about him, but because I didn't know too much about him, I'm not a German specialist, I'm not a professor of Rilke or anything like that. Because I didn't know too much about him, I was discovering him as I went on. And it became almost like getting to know a friend, or getting to know a friend's voice. And so in translating him, it was a kind of two-way communication. Oh, yes, that's how he wants me to say this. Well, how can I do that in English? But I also wanted it to be a pleasure to me, and I wanted to be writing something that was in my own style to a degree. So there were times when I just couldn't do anything more, find a way to say it, because he's so full of extraordinary metaphors, so full of extraordinary sounds. And sometimes you can't just translate it literally. Sometimes you have to find an equivalent. And sometimes it's a modern version. I didn't do that many times. I think I used a reference to apps at one point, which I will probably be criticised for. But it seemed like a modern equivalent of what he was saying. You can't modernize too much, but it's like making a movie, I suppose, where you decide, well, how much do I get these people to speak in a historical movie? Do I get them to speak the way people actually spoke, or do I do it the way people expect them to speak? So that was my approach. But it's a high wire act, and because there's the meter and rhyme to consider as well, you're trying to make it work. I allow myself half rhyme. I often use half rhyme, and that opens up more possibilities because English is rather limited in its rhymes. I think it's almost like composing music, or what I imagine composing music to be like. And I'm very interested in music, and because Rilke is a German poet or German-speaking poet, that sort of ties in quite nicely with what's going on there. I'm not sure he himself was particularly interested in music, but there's a music that he achieves in his poetry that I want to find an equivalent. So it's a kind of process of musical composition. Sometimes it is just the music of a line that will flow through my head before I write it down. So there's the music going on, there's the meaning, there's the metaphors, there's the other intricate technical things. All these are playing in your mind, but in the end, as I said, it is a mystery.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it is kind of like playing a concerto that someone else has written, and so the violinist will inevitably have to personalize it in order for it to become a living thing for the audience, even if the notes are set,
It's a very good parallel.
Well, let's come back then to Rilke and his way of seeing the world and writing as a poet. You speak about his attempt to, quote, in-see an object or a movement or an activity. So what does he mean by that? And how does that come through in his poetry?
Yes, it's related, I think, to this work with Rodin and seeing into whatever it is at the heart of a work of art, but then he applied that to other things as well. And I think he turned it to life in general and to people. Anything he looked at, he sort of drilled into them, and he'd go to the heart. I mean, it's an old idea in many ways. Wordsworth used to write about the line he said about, we see into the life of things, which is much the same idea, really. And Gerald Manley Hopkins had this thing about in seeing and inscape. So, and I think some of the American poets do as well. So it's not that new an idea, but I think it explains the spiritual potency of what he's writing, because he's going for some glowing core. He writes a wonderful poem about a scarab beetle where he gets that sense of look at this beetle, and it takes him out into the galaxies and the universe, really. So I think that's his spiritual access, really, the just looking hard. And really, that's the advice I would give to anybody who writes poetry. And I think that's probably how I discovered it myself. Certainly my very first poem, I talk about that in the Kevin Gardner selection of my poetry, which Bayard published, how I think my very first satisfactory poem, I was just staring at an apple tree down in Devon, consciously looking hard at it. And as I looked hard, the ideas came. I think that's the way poems certainly started that way for Rilke. Perhaps I learned that from Rilke because I was reading Rilke and reading about Rilke and reading Rilke's letters and his letter to a young poet, which is a very important book, and all young poets should read it, when I was 18, 19. So this stuff has been breeding in my head. It's come back now. I'm in my 70s.
Yes. Well, and what I mean, you mentioned that as a kind of spiritual practice, and what an exceptional discipline in a world in which attention spans are shortening by the minute. There's a remarkable generosity to take the time to look at something long enough to let its reality emerge. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of countercultural reality of that?
Well, yes, it's But you mustn't forget, it's a joy as well. You say it's a commitment and it's hard work, but it's you do it because it's a joy. But it is a paradox, isn't it? That in this age, but Rilke is still immensely popular, even in the age of short attention spans. And I suspect there's a lot of Rilke out there on social media, wrapped up in a different way from what it would have been 100 years ago. But the words are still there. And the marvelous thing about social media is you can listen to people reading it. You can listen to German actors reading it. Alas, we cannot hear Rilke reading it. Nobody thought, he died in 1926, but nobody thought to set Rilke down in front of a tape recorder or whatever the equivalent was then, and a wax cylinder, I suppose. Just like they never thought to set Hardy down in front of, or Edward Thomas. We've got other poets, we've got some recordings of Robert Browning and Tennyson, but nobody thought to record Rilke. It's an astonishing fact. Mind you, he didn't like technology. He didn't like telephones. He didn't like anything like that. So that's probably the reason. So yes, countercultural, it's surprising, but I think Rilke is still as popular as he ever was, and probably there's a greater need for him than ever simply because of that attention span. But they're short poems, so you don't need that much concentration to read them. You need to read them a few times, and you need to read them aloud. And I hope people will read my poems, my versions of Rilke aloud to try and get a sense of them. I hope the differences between American English and English aren't too much of a distraction. Just occasionally the pronunciation, I have to remind myself, oh, that's how it's pronounced in America. So that's fascinating in itself, actually. So you've got three cultures at work here, really.
That's right. That's right. Well, then why don't you, on that note, take us into a final poem, and you can read it for us in your English accent so we can be sure that we have it in the right inflection.
Yes, just as well I'm not reading it in German, I think. This is one of his animal poems. People know his panther one. He used to want. This was Rodin gave him this advice. He said, "Go and walk around the zoo. Let's look at the animals." And that's what he did. And one of the poems he wrote was about a gazelle, or Gazella Dorcas, as he calls it here. But he's thinking. This is typical of Rilke's playfulness. He's thinking of the gazelle. It's a kind of poem which is quite popular these days, and it comes from the word gazelle. So it's a kind of poem about the animal, but it's also a poem about poetry. Though perhaps all poems are about poetry, really. The Gazelle. Bewitching one, could rhyme of any kind evoke such consonance, however well it's crafted as your rising, falling spell? Above your forehead leaf and lyre ascend, and all that's you has grown through similes to a love poem. Words as soft as rose petals are lighting on the eyes of one who's closed them now, whose story time is done. So he can look at you, called up, those hind legs seeming to have been loaded for each leap, but kept from their release by your own turned head on its craned neck. As in the deep of a forest pool, a girl hears some distraction, her own face holding there the pool's reflection.
Wonderful. Well, John, thank you so much for sharing these poems with us. Thank you for, in some ways, being the medium through which we might encounter Rilke as readers. And thank you for publishing this with Baylor University Press. It's a real privilege to work with you again, and a real honor to publish new poems by Rilke and translated in this fresh translation by our very own John Greening. And it was lovely to talk to you today. Thank you for making time.
Thank you, Josh, and thanks to Baylor for publishing it. Bye-bye.
All right.
Thank you for listening to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.